які героїчно стримали ворога, а тепер не стримують себе і женуть окупанта на півночі, півдні і сході, на усіх напрямках, але рухаючись лише за одним вперед і до перемоги.
It's Saturday, September the 10th, 2022, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a Hoover Distinguished Policy Fellow. I'll be your moderator today. As we're doing this early on a Saturday morning in California, this is something of a slimmed-down version of GoodFellows. We're going to run for only about 30 minutes, and we're going to be shy one Goodfellow. Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster will not be joining us today, but we do have with us the economist John Cochrane, Hoover Senior Fellow, GoodFellows regular, and what makes this a very special broadcast, joining us live from Kyiv, Ukraine, truly the international man of history, GoodFellows regular, Hoover Senior Fellow historian Niall Ferguson. Hello, Niall.
Good to be with you.
So, Niall, you've been in Kyiv for about 36 hours now. You've been tracking this war for 6.5 months. Is your thinking changing at all now that you've been on the ground and had a chance to look around?
Yes, and it was changing even before I got here. I've arrived at a rather extraordinary moment in this war. As we speak, it is becoming clear that Ukrainian forces have achieved a major success with their counteroffensive in the vicinity of Kharkiv. The city of Izium has fallen. The Russians have fled, it appears, in some disarray. And so we're beginning to see the first signs that Ukraine's counteroffensive can meaningfully push the Russians back. Mm-hmm. What's fascinating, though, is how understated the Ukrainians are at this moment, when you might expect there to be jubilation. Quite the reverse. The messaging here is somber. President Zelenskyy told us yesterday that there will be 90 days of a winter of discontent to get through. He used that Shakespearean phrase. The messaging from all his ministers and other government officials is strikingly sober. They have understood the dangers of premature triumphalism. And that impresses me almost as much as the news of success from the battlefield. I'm really struck by the sense, the understanding here of how much trouble lies in the near future. And as John, I'm sure, will agree, the financial and monetary position, the economic position generally of Ukraine is a parlous one. Mm-hmm. As summer gives way to fall, it's pouring with rain outside, I should say. And the Ukrainians recognize that. They're not deluding themselves. And this is the big takeaway for me. I've come to realize that if they can get through these 90 days, if they can get through the winter of discontent, from that point on, time will be on their side and not on Russia's side. So I find myself in a very different frame of mind about the war than I was certainly at its outset, and even at the point when the Russians launched their or relaunched their military campaign, directing their efforts at the Donbass and Kherson. This is definitely not the beginning of the end. It would be very foolish to say that, but you can sense maybe the end of the beginning, and maybe something more than that.
Mm-hmm. And Niall, how does the Ukrainian government, how does the Ukrainian media define victory in this war? You, as someone from the UK, if you'd been in Britain in the 1940s, the objective was very simple: unconditional surrender by Germany. But what is the Ukrainian definition of victory?
Well, what the polls tell you, and there are opinion polls here, is that the Ukrainian public, which overwhelmingly backs President Zelenskyy, regards victory as not merely a return to the status quo ante February the 24th of this year. They want to go back to where we were prior to the 2014 annexation of Crimea and partial invasion of the Donbass. In other words, back to the original frontiers of Ukraine at the point of independence in 1991. The talk here is that next year we'll hold our meeting not in Kyiv but in Yalta in Crimea.
Wow.
So there's no question that the Ukrainian public has become more ambitious in its expectations. But as I said, the government itself is not talking such a big game. Though, if pressed, of course they will tend to say that because you certainly don't want to concede the notion that the annexation of Crimea is legitimate. This, of course, makes it clear that any kind of peace agreement is very far off indeed, because what the Ukrainians are willing to settle for is something that President Putin would certainly never settle for. So after more than 6 months of war, it's harder than ever to see how there could be any kind of compromise between the two combatants. But that is the mood, and it should be added, as I've been doing some reading on the Russian mood, that in Russia, as far as one can gather, of course, polling there is not in the least bit reliable, but those who pay attention through focus groups and by other methods to Russian opinion, they detect a certain enduring confidence that the so-called special military operation can be ended successfully. So in terms of outcomes, the two sides are very far apart indeed.
Mm-hmm. John?
Yeah, I just want to, wonderful chance to ask you a whole bunch of questions, and maybe you can pick and choose which of those you think have good or novel answers. First, of course, it seems natural that the Ukrainians are not celebrating victory because they need Europe and our support. Europe's support is both are there in limited quantity. They need our support in terms of weapons, in terms of money, and in terms of political support. So that they would say, "Hey, there's a long way to go, and we still need your help," seems completely natural. And I hope they will be gently reminding us that, in fact, we and Europe agreed to guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea, in return for it giving up nuclear weapons. And if we stand for anything, we ought to stand for that word and not some sort of accommodation. But what will Russia do? I want you to put on your Henry Kissinger hat. The Ukrainians are advancing, and I'm cheering, you're cheering, but one always must think of what the opponent will do. And what the opponent does if it starts to look like it's losing. I envisioned a Gulf War I scenario here. Ukraine winds up right at the Russian border and says stop, and that ends things. But it's not obvious that Russia can say stop and that ends things, even if it gets there, that's not just waiting for the next time around. It's not clear that Russia can Putin can politically absorb a defeat of that thing. So you've always been very good at worrying about the next step, and Russia simply calmly losing, giving up, and going back, and never mind, does not seem like an outcome. The longer term, Russia will now be separated from the European Union. What does that mean for Russia, for Europe? Going on. So give us your Kissinger on the long view of this thing and what you're learning from Ukrainians.
John, Henry Kissinger is not popular in Ukraine right now because a few months ago he had the temerity to suggest that at some point there would have to be some kind of settlement, and that there might be some compromise. He wasn't specific about that, but I think the Ukrainians took him to mean that some territory might not be restored, and this earned him a pretty blunt rebuff from President Zelenskyy. But it's a legitimate question that we have to ask. What happens next? There's a scenario which is not my base case, but it's a scenario worth thinking about, that the Russian army, which has suffered tremendously high casualties over the last 6 months, begins to unravel. Let me walk you through how that looks. If you take the US or UK estimates for Russian killed in action, the percentage of the invasion force that they've lost is very high indeed, somewhere between 9 and 12%. That's far higher than even US losses in the Korean War. So this has been a pretty disastrous military experience for the Russian army. It's an army which I've called a colonial army because so many of the troops are not from European Russia at all, but from really quite far east. We went to the scene of the atrocities in Bucha, where a suburb of Kyiv, where many civilians were massacred. The troops that carried out the massacre have as their home base a location to the east of North Korea. This colonial army is a long way from home in many cases, and they've suffered really brutal casualties by the standards of any modern war. So there's a scenario in which if Ukraine is able to hit them hard enough, as it appears to be doing right now, that army begins to collapse. Morale is crucial in warfare. And when armies begin to lose their morale, they can fall apart very fast. I did work on this many years ago on the collapse of the German army in the summer of 1918. So watch closely. It just might be that the Russian army is at a tipping point. I'm going to say that's not the base case because the Russians still have some formidable firepower. And the Ukrainians, it should be said, are taking very heavy casualties. They don't have much in the way of air cover, and they're really facing some very heavy bombardments. But this is the scenario which then leads to the question, what does Putin do if his army begins to unravel? And clearly he has escalation options, of which the scariest is that he uses a tactical nuclear weapon. He's already threatened to do that, so it wouldn't be surprising if he used that threat again. The Ukrainians are worried about this. Only the other day, a government spokesman said that we should take seriously the risk of limited nuclear war. And the goings-on at the Zaporizhia nuclear power station is another kind of nuclear threat that the Russians have been using. And this is what President Zelenskyy calls radioactive terrorism. So the threat of some kind of Chernobyl-like scenario is part of the story here. In other words,
he may want to tell the West this has to stop. And how does he do that? And yeah, I was thinking the nuclear plant or a tactical nuclear weapon seems like thing. I also wanted to interject your previous point, which I think is excellent. The Ukrainian strategy of going back to the supply lines, cutting off Russians, encircling them, and then forcing them to give up rather than frontal assault is designed exactly to lead to that sort of breakdown of morale. But please go on.
Well, John, I think that the tricky thing is to work out what other options there might be. Ukraine's military forces rely very heavily on satellite technology because it's through that their high-end weapon systems like HIMARS, which we have provided them with, those work, and they work with incredible precision. I've heard speculation from military experts I respect that the Russians could contemplate attacks on satellites. And that's something that they have a capability to do. So there are things that Putin can do that seem to me more likely than him folding. Whether, of course, he would get his generals to carry out an order to use a nuclear weapon is another question, and that's pretty hard to know the answer to given how opaque Russia's power structures have become. And I'm struck by the fact that the military experts who are here with me in Kyiv don't seem as worried about that nuclear scenario as I certainly was earlier in the conflict. But yeah, it would be a mistake to assume that these victories that we're hearing about right now from the battlefield mean that this is going to be over soon, because Putin clearly has options to escalate. And he also knows, and this is important, John, he knows that we intimidated when he rattles that nuclear saber, because it was one of the things that deterred us from supplying the Ukrainians with planes earlier in the war.
Neil, I'd like to shift back to Zelenskyy for a moment. Here in the West, he is romanticized, he is lionized, he is lauded for his conduct during this war, but you've had a chance to watch up close now to see how he presents himself to the Ukrainian people. Is he omnipresent? Is he on the media 24/7? And on a related note, Neil, why aren't you wearing camouflage?
Well, there's a kind of interesting style tip for visitors to Ukraine. Don't dress in the green T-shirt. Only the president and his very senior ministers, like the prime minister, get to do that.
Right.
And so the higher up you are in Ukraine, the more you dress like a lowly soldier. It's quite interesting how that works. You might remember the French president Emmanuel Macron made a terrible mistake in his election campaign when he dressed up in the Zelensky outfit in the
Yes.
Elysee Palace. They still make jokes about that here. So you won't see me in a green t-shirt for a good long while. I think that what's fascinating about this war is that Volodymyr Zelensky, whom I met some years ago before this war broke out, has become the modern hero, not only in the eyes of his people but around the world. And I think it's true to say that this is one of the most unlikely metamorphoses in modern political history, because he was a man who became president in an almost postmodern way, having been a comedian, a very versatile comedian, an entertainer, who in a sitcom played the part of an ordinary guy who becomes president. And then he became president. Now, you wouldn't have predicted that someone who came to power by that route would turn out to be a Churchillian figure, capable of rallying his people at a time of such dire military crisis that the United States government was offering to fly him out to avoid his being captured or killed by Russian special forces. And Zelensky's retort, "I don't need a plane ticket, I need ammunition," is painted on the wall of the venue where I've been participating in a conference. He himself has become a strangely magnetic figure. He's relatively diminutive, but muscular. And the unshaven chin contributes to a personality transformation. Gone is the cheerful, joking, and youthful president I first met. Now one is confronted by a kind of warrior who wouldn't look out of place in one of those Lord of the Rings shows that they screen these days on Prime, or is it Netflix? I'm not a great television guy, as you know. What I'm struck by is that not only is his image part of the morale of the Ukrainian people, and it's a kind of antithesis to Putin, very consciously antithetical. My good friend, the journalist Ann Applebaum, made the point that Zelensky has set about being the anti-Putin. If Putin's table for meetings is ludicrously long, Zelensky will sit you down at the smallest cafeteria type table. If Putin's dressed up in a probably Italian suit, then Zelensky's outfit will be, as we've said, extraordinarily dressed down. But there's another point that is not so widely appreciated, and that is that in addition to his personality, his image, he also wields considerable power here. And it's not too much to say that Zelensky has become a far more powerful figure institutionally than he was prior to the war. No one talks about the oligarchs who used to be the dominant figures in Ukrainian political and economic life. And that's because, as my friend Anders Olsen was explaining, they've become far less powerful as a result of the war. And one has a sense, looking at the other members of Zelensky's government, that they don't say anything that he hasn't effectively scripted. His prime minister essentially repeated what Zelensky said yesterday when he spoke today. So it's more than just image. I think Zelensky is, in fact, running this show. And right now, he's running it very well indeed. You can't deny that.
John?
Do you get a sense, one big question is where Ukraine goes after this, what the feelings of people on the street are. So a wonderful leader is great, but Ukraine needed to develop a civil society, a functional government, less corrupt. Little stories I read, the heroism of the railroad workers, ordinary people pitching in, that this is the experience that forms a nation and I hope forms its political structures as well. Do you get that sense that Ukraine will come out of this not just a powerful big man on top is useful in a war, but not exactly where we want Ukraine to go in the peace. But where? So this feelings of people on the street, your sense of the evolution of Ukrainian politics, what the country will emerge like this afterwards.
Well, Ukraine has held up against the Russian invasion, not just because of a personality cult. It's held up because the state and the military turned out to work far better than anybody predicted, including US intelligence. And perhaps more importantly, Ukrainian civil society has proved to be extraordinarily resilient. This is, I think it's not too much to say, a birth of a nation moment. It's reminiscent to me of the fights for liberation that one saw in the 19th century. One thinks of the Greeks 2 centuries ago throwing off the Ottoman yoke, the Italians throwing off the Habsburg yoke. It is a kind of classic national awakening. And that was something Ukraine needed, because prior to this, it was still a very divided society. And indeed, one used to talk about the divisions between East and West Ukraine. Those have gone. And I think what's really striking to me is that amongst young Ukrainians, there is absolutely no doubt that the country's future lies in the West. They talk here about EU accession. That was something that was made clear by numerous government spokesmen. That's the plan. They fully intend to pursue that option as rapidly as they can. And I think what's really critical here is that that's the Ukraine that young Ukrainians want. And remember, in a war, the morale of your young people is really the critical variable, because you've got to persuade them to don uniforms and go and risk their lives. And one encounters all the time absolutely extraordinary stories. Earlier today, I met a young man, a lawyer, an accomplished lawyer, who has just returned from the front, having narrowly survived hideous wounds. He lost an eye. He was wearing an eye patch. He suffered other injuries too. But the amazing thing about his story is that he was born in Kabul. He's actually an immigrant to Ukraine. His brother is in the government. And he gave a most moving testament to the war as he sees it. And of course, the veterans, and there will be a significant number of returning veterans like him who've suffered severely in the war, are going to expect a very different Ukraine from the Ukraine of last year. So I do think there's a very transformative thing happening here. And it represents, I think, the end, really, of the Soviet generation, the generation that remembered the Soviet Union calling the shots. The younger generation has absolutely no doubt that its future lies with the West. But I think they're beginning to see that it's not just going to be a matter of copying and pasting what Poland did. Because of their situation, because of what they've just been through, they need to be more like Israel and accept that, as one minister said earlier today, that their proficiency in modern warfare has to be a feature, not a bug, and has to be something that they focus on and use as the basis for technological leadership, as Israel has done so successfully as a startup nation in the last 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, John.
No, yeah, you're also painting that even after this ends, they and Russia will be looking at each other over a testy border for a long time.
I think unless there is a regime change of some kind in Russia, which I really wouldn't bet on, that's right. And I think one has to accept that a war like this isn't likely to result anytime soon in a stable peace. It's more likely, I think, to be like the way the Korean War ended. After a period of very violent and kinetic warfare, things got bogged down. And in the end, you got an armistice, a kind of tie, a demilitarized zone, but never a peace agreement. And I could imagine something like that happening if we're brutally honest. It's hard to see with their current capability that Ukraine has the firepower to drive the Russians right out, not only of Kherson and Donbass, but the Crimea too. I mean, that's really hard to see, particularly given the limits of their military capability, the lack of air power that they have. The kind of offensive they'd have to wage to drive Russia right out would be incredibly costly in terms of lives. So I think if one's being more Kissinger than Zelensky in thinking about this, at some point the fighting just won't be sustainable by the two sides at this pitch. And then you can see some kind of demilitarized zone and a permanent tense relationship of the sort that we've grown accustomed to between North and South Korea.
And then Russia becomes a cutoff from the West, a North Korea satellite of China. So China picks up another North Korea, and it slowly or rather quickly decays into that horrible state until, I guess, it changes regime.
I mean, John, there are two really interesting economics points here that I think you'll have thoughts on. The interesting thing in the Russian case is that although the financial sanctions that were the talk of the town at the beginning of the war did not bring the Russian economy or the war machine to its knees, the slow burn of export controls means that Russia's industry is in a parlous state and the outlook is bleak. I just read an excellent paper on this subject by a group of economists looking carefully at trade data to show, for example, that Chinese exports to Russia have collapsed, that Russian car manufacturing has collapsed. The outlook for the Russian economy is actually pretty grim. And guess who they're having to sell their gas to now? Yeah, that's right, China. And guess what price the Chinese are paying? That's right, well below the price that they were getting from Europe. So I think Russia has put itself in a position of dependence on China without getting support in return, because the Chinese are not supporting the Russians in ways that would help the Russians win this war. And that's one of the most notable features of the past 6.5 months, that the Chinese basically took the warning they received from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. They took it to heart. They have not done anything to incur secondary sanctions. And that's one of the reasons those trade numbers are down. The Chinese just aren't sending a whole lot that the Russians could put to use in this conflict. So I see Russia as on track to being a dependency of China, though, of course, it's a much larger economy than North Korea's. We have to remember that, this is the big difference.
Right.
Russia, by cutting off gas to Europe, it may have thought, oh, we're going to make a hard winter for Europe, but it seems pretty clear that within 2 to 3, that Europe's got the lesson. And 2 to 3 years from now, it will be importing nothing from Russia and will never import anything from Russia again. Now, gas and oil are a world market, so it leaks out fairly successfully, but nowhere near as easily as sending stuff to Europe. And you're exactly right. The import controls. There was one piece of Russian propaganda that might have actually been true when they said we cut off the Nord Stream pipeline, not out of spite, but because thanks to the sanctions, we can't get pieces to keep the turbines running. Well, that's actually quite possibly true, and certainly a symbol of what's going to happen throughout the Russian economy.
We have about 5 minutes left, and Neil, I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask you about the passing of Queen Elizabeth, the only monarch you have known. 2 questions for you, Neil. First of all, your thoughts on her, what set her apart, but secondly, the future of British identity, what the nation's identity will look like without her, because you're losing the living face of your currency.
It's hard for a Briton like me not to be moved. A 70-year reign is something that connects you to, 4 generations of your own family. I can remember my grandfather urging me to watch the Queen's Christmas address every year. He would reverently listen to it. I did too. And that became part of the fabric of our family. The thing about the British national anthem is that it contains some stirring words, and I've sung them many times. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us, God save the Queen. Well, he kind of did. He did send her victorious, happy and glorious, and she did reign long over us. And those words have a resonance for me now that they didn't have before. I think it's important to remember that perhaps her greatest contribution was to preside over the decline and fall of the British Empire.
Right.
And to do that, to manage that process, to be, in a sense, its symbol in a way that minimized the anguish and conflict that usually attends the end of an empire. And this, I think, when I ponder it, is her real historical significance. Other European empires did not go down so gracefully. Think of the violence that characterized the French exit from Algeria. And I could name many other examples. Right. And of course, Russia is perhaps the last and ugliest of these European empires, still clinging on to the delusion that somehow Ukraine belongs to it. So, yeah, I think this was an extraordinary achievement to reconcile Britain to this complete transformation in its global role. How we cope in her absence, of course, is going to depend on things that she could not control. How her son, who's waited so long to be King Charles III, plays that part. And of course, and this is where it gets really tricky, how Britain navigates its winter of discontent. Because as Zelenskyy said, the winter of discontent isn't just Ukraine's, it's going to be a European-wide winter of discontent. And in the short run, things don't look too pretty for Britain and its new prime minister. It's not every day you get a new monarch and a new prime minister all in the same few days. That just happened. Liz Truss is now prime minister, as untested a figure as ever took that office over. So we shall see how she and how the new king fare. Can only hope that he sends him victorious, happy and glorious. He certainly isn't going to reign over us as long as his mother did, that's for sure.
And the future of the monarchy, Neil?
That, I think, is assured. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is that even in moments of doubt about the monarchy, and there have been many, one forgets this now, but many over the course of the Queen's reign. Think of the upheaval at the time of the death of Princess Diana. Even at those low points, we can always look across the Atlantic and ask how presidential systems compare. If you make the head of state an elected office, then everything becomes a part of your democracy, and that, of course, can create problems, as Americans know. The politicization of everything in American life, from the Supreme Court right down to whether you get vaccinated or not, I don't think is a healthy thing. And one of the things that makes Britain seem like a bit of a relief after exposure to American politics is that not everything is political, and the monarchy is a key to that. Monarchy is actually a remarkably stable system. I know American listeners won't like to hear this, but the persistence of monarchy is one of the reasons the world isn't in a permanent state of political upheaval. So yeah, I think the monarchy will be fine. No doubt there'll be ups and downs. There was a wonderful play that I saw about 10 years ago about how Charles's reign would go, called Charles III, and it was a pastiche Shakespeare. I hope somebody puts it on again soon, which rather amusingly imagined a great constitutional crisis caused precisely because Charles couldn't resist getting involved in politics. I hope he resists that temptation. Other Charleses came to unhappy ends. I don't want to go into further detail, but he should bear that in mind.
John, you have one last question for Neil.
His earlier namesakes are interesting. You know, I'm an American, and we founded this country, and we don't believe in monarchy. And in an era where it mattered who the monarch was, and you know, good kings and good queens can do well. The problem was, as anyone with a large family knows, there's a good chance the next one is a nincompoop, and then you have to wait a long time. And I think Britain's monarchy has evolved to where it doesn't matter if the next one is that much of a nincompoop. But it's not a presidential system. In Britain, you swear allegiance to the Queen. We swear allegiance to the Constitution. And I think the Constitution really forms that bedrock of conservation of what the state and the society is. And God save the Constitution. It is in as much danger as the monarchy. And I'll just note that Liz Truss, the supposedly libertarian prime minister, 10 minutes into her reign, the first thing she did was to pass 100 billion, how much was it? 100 billion pounds of energy subsidies to silence the rising price of energy and its signal to conserve. I hope Charles lasts in his principles and his decorum and devotion to duty a little bit longer.
I feel sure he will, John. And remember, I share your feelings of loyalty to the Constitution as an American citizen. One of the curiosities of being a dual citizen is that you can simultaneously be a monarchist and a Republican in the sense of being loyal to a Republican Constitution. I'll never quite get over the sense that there's a contradiction there, but I'd say living it is, at this point, going not too bad. And it certainly beats the predicament of Ukraine fighting a war of independence against a far nastier empire than Americans had to fight against back in the 1770s.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, I think we're going to wrap it at that point. Neil, it's Saturday night in Kyiv. I'm not sure what passes for nightlife in Kyiv right now, but we'll be looking for a report on that as well. And by all means, my friends, safe travels. We look forward to having you back on the Stanford campus in the near future.
Great news that nightlife is pretty much back because the curfew got moved to 11 o'clock recently. And like many a capital during wartime, Kyiv has an air of normality, which shades into a certain frivolity. Those people who are back from the front line are obviously happy to be back here. But it's a curious atmosphere, and one that I haven't experienced for a very long time. I'm just glad to have been here at a time when the news from the front line was so much better, and it's great to be able to talk about that to the GoodFellows audience. Too bad HR wasn't here to hear the good news. I can't help feeling that this would have made his day.
I think we'll be talking about it again when HR is back on the show. So Neil, be careful out there, and again, we look forward to seeing you soon, my friend. Take care.
Thanks.
And that's it for this episode of GoodFellows. If you're curious about when we'll be back, very simple. Subscribe to our show and rate us while you're at it. We like getting those stars. On behalf of my colleagues, John Cochrane and the traveling international man of history, Niall Ferguson, we hope you enjoyed this conversation. And again, thanks for watching our show, and we will see you soon. Take care.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring H.R. McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.